Hello. I'm going to help you to relax today. So go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more videos like this. And if I didn't help you to relax, please let me know how I can improve. Before we get started, I want you to be as comfortable as possible. So, if you're wearing any clothes that might be too tight or restrictive, change into something more comfortable. Once that's done, and you're ready to start, get into the most comfortable position as possible. Any position that allows you to let go. So let's get started. We are driving down the interstate at night. You have your seatbelt on, and I'm an amazing driver, so you can feel safe with me. As you sit next to me in the passenger seat, the humming from the car's engine sends a feeling of relaxation that vibrates throughout your body. I turn on the seat warmers, and you sink into your seat and lightly close your eyes. Focusing on the sound of my voice, you recline your seat back so you can lay comfortably and sink down into the cushion of your seat. Breathe for me. Take a long, slow, deep breath into your nose for the mental count of 4. Open your mouth. And as you exhale all the air from your body, let go and relax. Release it. Take a long, slow, deep breath into your nose for the mental count of 4. And as you exhale all the air from your body, let go. Let go. Take another long, slow, deep breath into your nose. Exhale and let go. Let go and trust. Shift your body side to side to find a position that allows you to release all the tension in your body. Gently rock your head from side to side so you can let go of all the tightness in your neck and your shoulders. Open your mouth a little and slowly move your jaw from side to side, releasing the tension in your jaw. Relax the muscles around your eyes and your forehead and your scalp, easing all the tension in your head so you can sink deeper and deeper into the warmth of the seat. If there is any tension left over in your body. I want you to find it and allow the warmth of the seat to soak into those places so it melts all the tightness away. Melt all the tightness away. Your legs and your arms feel heavy now. Continue to breathe deeply, inhaling the color yellow, which represents happiness. Let it flow throughout your body, from the tips of your fingers to your toes, and all the way up to your head. When you exhale, I want you to imagine a black cloud of negativity and doubt, leaving your body feeling lighter, happier. Keep breathing deeply, sinking deeper and deeper, becoming more and more relaxed. I want you to focus on the sound of the engine and the sound of your breathing. If any invasive thoughts try to wander into your mind, I want you to imagine it as words on a traffic sign so that it can slowly come into view. You acknowledge it and let it slowly fade behind you into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller until it disappears, clearing from your mind. It's a beautiful night. The sky is clear and you can see the bright, shimmering stars for miles. And if you have any saliva in your mouth, you can swallow it without disturbing yourself. And relax. For the deeper you go, the better you feel. The better you feel, the deeper you go. So go much deeper now as I count 8, 7, 6, down deeper now. 5, letting go. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. A beautiful feeling of peace and happiness fills your body. Enjoy this feeling of deep relaxation. Continue breathing deeply and exhaling slowly. Clouds are starting to form in the starry sky as the wind starts to pick up. The earthy smell of rain is drifting through the air. You can hear thunder in the distance. You feel safe knowing that I am here with you. I am here with you. You are safe here. Continue to breathe deeply. Focus on the calming sounds of the thunderstorm and sleep. When you wake up at your normal waking time, you will feel refreshed and well rested, excited to start your day. Everybody Pick Their Grave by Psyopticnerve and Simba the Savage 8. My father wasn't a very patient man. Well, that's putting it lightly. In all actuality, he was completely out of his mind. He was tasked with raising the 6 of us kids after our mother left, likely to get as far away from him as she possibly could. But I don't think he ever wanted us. Never said it to our faces or anything, but we somehow got that impression. Every once in a while, we'd forget a chore, or break something, or make too much noise, and something would snap inside his brain. That's it. Everybody, pick a grave, he'd bellow, spittle flying from his chapped lips. And we'd do exactly that. He'd line us up and march us deep out into the woods with shovels. And we'd dig 6 holes, 6 feet deep, 6 tiny bodies trembling while he paced above us, alternating between pleading and crying and laughing uncontrollably with the invisible people that seemed to surround him on days like these. I always felt something down there in the dirt. Felt, or maybe heard. There were voices. Angelic choirs singing wordless songs that called out to me, reached out for me, reached for me, encompassed me. They came from somewhere deep, maybe from somewhere inside the Earth's core, or maybe they came from the universe itself. They swirled around me, these enchanting, chaotic harmonies that resonated inside my very bones. And I'd lay there, gazing up at the sky, wondering if my brothers and sisters could hear them too. I stayed there the longest the next time it happened. Even when my dad decided enough was enough, and my brothers and sisters were rounded up and told to head back home. Hours passed, and I watched the blue, blue sky dissolve into a cocktail of pinks and reds and oranges. I couldn't get up. I didn't want to get up. The choir was promising me something I always wanted. A place where I would never walk on eggshells all the time. Their words echoed around and around my head. We will love you. We will love you. We will love you. When the night came, I returned to my house for a shovel, and with resolve, I would be with the angels, whatever it took. I found the grave again with the help of the moon, and I started to dig. Finally, I hit something, and as the moon pulled back from the clouds and shone down on it in a long white arm, I bit back a scream. My mother was down there. But at the same time, it wasn't my mother. Her hair was gnarly like seaweed and rushed down her face. Her face was as pale as the moon, and her eyes were missing. My mother sat up and choked me in an embrace. I hugged back, crying. I missed my mother so very much. As the dirt rolled back over the grave, though, I heard her chuckling. One down, 5 to go. My Haunted Life, Bath Night, written by Dr. Gallow. I couldn't tell you for sure whether or not my old house on Kilmurray Gardens was haunted. Of course, I saw things from time to time, and my mother claimed to as well. Were they ghosts? I don't know. I remember some of the things very vividly, but memory can be unreliable, and it was such a long time ago. It certainly wasn't an old house, steeped in draconian mysteries or long dark shadows. It was a very modest but relatively new build on what the townsfolk called the electric scheme. It had been one of the first to have electric streetlights, long before I was born, but the name had stuck. I think people still call it that to this day. It was small, too. There wasn't much room for me and my mother, let alone any unwanted guests from the other side. There were 2 floors, but it was an oddly narrow house. The rooms were tiny. Nonetheless, there were times I was sure we were not alone. We had several cats over the years, but none stayed. They would all have these strange outbursts of hostility, not towards us, but sometimes to an object like a cup or a book, or sometimes an empty space in a room. They would hiss and growl as if to warn something away. The sort of sounds that they make at each other when one cat is unwelcome. Neither my mother nor myself dared go near them in that state. They were wild and terrifying. When whichever cat had finished its weird, angry little tirade at seemingly nothing, they would go back to purring and grooming themselves as if nothing had happened. My mother would be too freaked out to keep it by that point, though. So, off went Judy, Gizmo, Mayo, and Chuffs to new homes, and without much upset. They were never part of the family for long enough for us to get very attached. We had no shower unit. Our bathroom upstairs was literally that. A room with a toilet, a sink, and a metal bath that sat on 4 legs, and one of those things that you stick on both the hot and cold taps that has a shower nozzle attached to it. They were always made of thick rubber, so it was impossible to tell if the water was scalding or freezing until it hit you in the face. Either way, there were a lot of yelps. My mother used to let me mess around with it for a bit, before it was time for her to wash my hair. I used to blast the mounds of floating bubble bath foam with it as if I was Triton or Neptune, wrathfully melting icebergs in my tiny ocean. Eventually, I would get bored and turn it on myself and let the water wash over my face until Mother came in. I'd shouted to tell her that I was ready. I'd gotten so bored that night that I'd actually lathered up the shampoo in my hair myself, and badly. The foam had run down over my eyes, so I knew that if I were to open them, I would face certain stinging doom. The shower thing was pumping hot water into the bath near my toes, and it felt good. So I just waited. Shortly, I heard the door creak, and in a moment, her hands were on my scalp and in my hair, scrubbing gently. I used to love that part. I don't think anything in my adult life has ever relaxed me as much as my mom washing my hair for me. I heard the phone start to ring, and that put an end to my short moment of bliss. We had a landline phone. It wasn't so old-fashioned that it had a rotary dial, but mobile phones weren't common at all when I was growing up. Auntie Val used to call us every Sunday night, which, coincidentally, was always bath night too. I don't know if she'd rang early that night or I'd had my bath late, but either way, my lovely, relaxing hair wash was about to come to an abrupt halt. The phone was downstairs. It rang once, twice, 3 times. And my mother just kept scrubbing my head. It wasn't like her to ignore the phone, but who was I to argue? Then, the ringing stopped, and I heard a muffled voice. I could tell it was my mother's. She shouted then that my Auntie Val was on the phone, and that she'd be up in 5 minutes. The fingers that were embedded in the curls of my hair tightened a little, stretching the skin of my scalp, and that's when I started to scream. The next few minutes were a bit of a blur, or perhaps I just don't remember them that clearly. I was out of the bath soon and wrapped up in my mother's arms, drying off by the fire. I remember eating some sort of pudding that I thought was butterscotch. I don't remember her being angry with me, but I have a feeling she didn't take what had happened very seriously. In spite of her telling me occasionally she'd seen odd things herself, she'd often put my experiences down to me watching too many horror movies. Which was her fault, of course, because she let me watch them. We talked about it years later, after I had become an adult, and she had gotten decidedly more gray. She didn't remember the flavor of the pudding either, but she remembered a few other more important things. She remembered hearing my screams and running up the stairs. She remembered Auntie Val racing round to the house and banging on the front door to find out what the hell had been going on, because she'd heard my screaming over the phone. It was a funny old thing, though, she'd told me. She couldn't work out why I'd gotten out of the bath before chaos erupted. I told her that I hadn't. I'd been in the bath waiting for her the whole time. But I must have, she told me, because when she got to the top of the stairs, there were wet footprints all the way down the landing carpet that led from the bathroom and stopped in front of the wall at the end of the house. She couldn't figure out how I'd managed to get back in the bath and leave a single trail going away from it. You must have walked backwards, she said. Now, come to think of it, she said, they were big footprints for such a little girl. We met on the internet. Written by GarnetAndOpal. Subreddit, Scattered Light. Dale seemed like an amazing guy. And the first time we talked over cams, I felt pretty hard for him. He was strong and smart, very masculine. That's my type. I don't have a physical type. I go for those hard to find, non-visual qualities. And he checked the first 3 boxes without even trying. He seemed a bit hesitant, saying he had been burned before. And then he told me that he doesn't start out telling women he's interested in that he's handicapped. They wig out on him, or they chicken out. They tell him things like, I don't know if I can handle it. I'm not biased, but I don't think we're a good fit. When they were a good fit 2 minutes earlier. Not to insult you or anything, but it's a turnoff for me. I couldn't believe grown women could be such chicken shits. It was like they turned into fourth graders playing cooties with the boys. He lost a leg in an accident at work. A 550-pound plumbing pipe rack fell off a truck and knocked him over, pulverizing his femur and pinning his right leg to the pavement. He took his belt off and managed to get it under his butt enough to make a tourniquet up high on his thigh. "Good thing I dressed left," was his wry comment while telling me the story. He couldn't manage to get the rack off of himself, and his manager was no help in that. In fact, his manager had a full-blown panic attack and had to be calmed down enough to get his cell phone. He handed it to Dale. Dale coordinated his own rescue because his manager couldn't breathe and think at the same time. The manager was busy breathing in a lunch bag and literally could not speak. After a couple years of recovery and physical therapy, Dale got a prosthetic leg. He said that he had ghost pains and itches on the leg he lost, and sometimes he had sores on his stump, but it wasn't anything that he couldn't handle. If he could handle it, so could I. Dale and I talked over cams for a couple of months, and we talked on our phones daily too. He called me in the morning to get me up. I thought that was so cute. He was showing me how useful he could be. He called me every night, and we would talk until he'd say, "Puddin' Pop, it's getting late." A couple months later, when it got late, I would take my phone to bed with me, and he would sexy talk me. His voice was so silky. After nearly a year of long-distance dating, Dale told me he had a round-trip plane ticket to come up and visit me. I was thrilled. We had talked about it, and I wasn't sure if he could afford the airfare. Then, suddenly, he announced it was going to happen. He was coming from Nebraska to Ohio to meet me. He could only be away for 2 weeks, but that was great with me. I could get the same amount of time off myself. I had been saving my time off for just exactly this. I got the flight information and told him I would pick him up at the airport. He was a manly man, for sure. The moment I saw him in the flesh, I was impressed as hell. For a guy with a prosthetic leg, he walked around like he owned the joint. No hesitation, no limp, no slouch. His stride was smooth and strong, long and proud. I pulled up and popped out of the car as soon as I had it in park. He walked around the front of the car, threw down his backpack, and grabbed me with both arms, bending me over for a Hollywood kiss. It was my first ever kiss like that. He planted his lips on mine, holding me up because my balance was off, and the kiss seemed to suck all the air out of me. When he broke off the kiss, I had to grab hold of him. I wasn't steady enough to stand up just yet. My kitchen was where he proposed to me days later. He told me I still had the chance to back out. I still a chance to tell him no. I was so crazy in love with him, I couldn't have formed the word no even if I wanted to. He cried when I said yes. And he picked me up, as if I weighed half what I actually weigh, and carried me up the stairs to my bedroom. We had Hollywood sex. It was like a movie, only I was in it. Intellectually, I knew that life wasn't going to be all roses at the start. I would have to sell my house and move to Nebraska. It was the wiser choice. The cost of living was so much lower, the air cleaner, etc., etc. Dale had a couple acres just outside of Seward and owned his home, so there wouldn't be a mortgage hanging over us. It would be easy, but I would have to rehome my dog, since Dale's dog was older and not friendly to other dogs. Dale's daughter lived with him for the moment, as did her mother and her mother's second husband. It was temporary. Dale told me that he wasn't helping his ex-wife. He was helping his daughter. His daughter was 20 and still lived with her mother, who had fallen on some hard times. So I knew life would be messy for a while, but it would be worth it. I was going to marry the man of my dreams and have my happiest life ever. I got everything ready for my departure date. After I landed at Seward Airport, I got my baggage. I had only one case. I had shipped everything else straight to my new home. I started looking for Dale. The man who came to pick me up was not the Dale I remembered. Oh, he walked the same and looked the same, but his mannerisms were all different. That silky, sexy voice he used was gruff. He said, "Hi." Then he grabbed my suitcase and started walking toward his truck. No hug, no kiss, just hi. I thought it was strange, but maybe he was having a bad day. As we drove off in his truck, he dialed someone on his Bluetooth and started yelling. He yelled on the Bluetooth the entire way to his house, a double-wide trailer in a scrubby plot of land surrounded by not much else. "Mandy, come get that suitcase out of the truck," he yelled as soon as he got out. His daughter Mandy appeared at the door. Her appearance was a bit of a shock. I knew what she looked like, generally. I had seen her in his cam a couple times, and he left her on cam once while he left the room to go get a cup of coffee. She told me in confidential tones, "I've been diagnosed suicidal and homicidal. I try to take my medicine, but sometimes I just don't feel like it. I think blood is funny. I always laugh when my friends get hurt and they show me." I figured she was just trying to scare me off. And after all, I was the new woman in Dale's life. When Mandy appeared on the front porch, I could tell she had put on some more weight since I had seen her. She was wearing cut-off shorts and a spaghetti-strap top, so her arms and legs were uncovered. Both arms and legs were covered in old scars that looked like ones I had seen in an article about self-harm. Then Mandy's mother came out onto the porch to say hello to me, and I was shocked right down to my shoes. All the woman had on was a t-shirt and baggy underpants. Her tits were 2 different sizes. I tried not to look directly at them, but there they both were. It was a strappy t-shirt and it held no secrets. If a home can be spare in furnishings and still slapdash, that was Dale's house. The only room that had a lot of furniture in it was Dale's bedroom. He had a bed, 2 dressers, 2 broad nightstands, a huge TV on a stand, and 2 large recliners shoved into his room. I nearly had to crawl over the furniture to get from one side of the room to the other. There were piles of clothes on top of boxes all over the living room. There were no decorative things anywhere. No pictures on the walls, no figurines. There wasn't even a towel to dry my hands on in his bathroom. While we were having dinner, Trooper, Dale's dog, humped every single cushion on the couch and then proceeded to drag his butt on the carpet. Trooper also didn't know any of the normal commands like sit, stay, down. He was an untrained beast that Dale's ex fed from her own fork. I had never seen a home like this, nor met any people like this. It was complete culture shock. It was like coming from a high-rise apartment to a small house. Basic things were lacking, and no one seemed to care. Even so, I didn't put a halt on the wedding, which was a week and a half after I arrived. I kept telling myself that all the things that disturbed me were external stuff. His furnishings didn't reflect on him. His ex and her second husband, who looked like the crypt keeper, were going to move out soon and take his daughter with them. There wouldn't be anyone sleeping on the floor in the living room anymore. Maybe they would take Trooper too, since it seemed to be more Dale's ex's dog. Everything would all get sorted out, and I would get to have my happiest life ever. That was 4 years ago. His ex and her husband moved out just a couple months after we got married, but Mandy stayed with us. Dale's ex calls at any hour of the day, usually to bitch about what Mandy has or has not done. She once called at 3:45 in the morning because she didn't like the way Mandy walked out the door just before dinner time the night before. She hadn't made enough food to feed 3 people, but that didn't figure into the half of the conversation I heard. Mandy has turned strange in the past 6 months. Instead of being the jealous kid trying to scare me away from her dad, she hangs all over me. Now she tells me that I am the mom she always wished she had. She She's always trying to kiss me or hug me. She tells me several times a day that she loves me. Whenever Dale and I fight, she comes out of her room to tell him he is wrong. And she is afraid I am going to leave her. When she leaves the house, she calls me several times while she's out. She always calls Dale too. I can hear her talking because she talks super loud on the phone, as if she doesn't think her voice will carry. The first thing she says to Dale is, "How's Mom?" She means me. She calls me Mom in front of her mother, even though it sparks a huge family fight every time she does that. She texts me pics of herself every time she tries on clothes or changes her hairstyle. I feel so smothered sometimes. It's like I can't even breathe. Dale himself has never changed from the gruff guy who met me at the airport. We haven't had sex since I moved here, not even on our wedding night. The last time we talked about that, he told me he would let me know when he is in the mood. And that was 8 months ago. Dale and I fight every day or every other day. It seems like we can start having a normal conversation and suddenly he starts shouting. He tells me that I can't understand anyone who doesn't come from the same background I did. He tells me that I've been sheltered and I don't really know anything about the real world. He says I don't know what normal looks like. He grinds it in that he didn't have the benefit of college like I did. He tells me that I am a snob because I don't want to hang out with his ex and her family when he goes over to visit her. Apparently, I don't accept people for who they are. That's what Dale says. He tells me I don't support him. I only argue about everything. He says I have a shitty attitude. But I am the only one in the house who has a job. Dale let Mandy's boyfriend Arbus move in with us without even asking me. And Arbus only has sporadic employment. He either gets fired or walks off the job. Arbus's only real concern seems to be video games. He has never bought groceries or contributed to any household expense, and he doesn't pay rent. Dale said that if he kicks Arbus out, Mandy would leave too, and he can't have his girl living out on the street. I keep wondering what happened to the guy I fell in love with. I can't believe this is how my life is turning out. I keep wondering whether I just cut my losses and leave. If I could, I would just go to a motel for a few days and think it all over. But after paying all the utilities and buying groceries for the week, I have less than $50. I wonder if I'm safe. I don't know who it was, but I saw a crumpled up piece of paper in the kitchen trash can. Someone was trying to sign my name. I don't know what it's about, but I am on edge every minute of every day. The Neighbor, written by Dr. Gallow. I only saw the old man who moved into the apartment next door once, and that was on the morning he arrived. He was polite enough, wishing me a cheerful good day, and he looked smart in a shirt and bow tie combination that only gentlemen of a certain age can really pull off. His hair was thin and white, but not unkempt, combed neatly over in a side parting. And then he was inside. The door was closed, and I didn't see him again. I certainly heard him, though. I mean, everyone's noisy sometimes, aren't they? You expect it in a place like this. The walls between these apartments are hardly thick enough, and I heard the young couple who lived on the other side before him occasionally, but they were quiet as a mouse in comparison. He made an awful lot of noise for such an old fella. He was always shouting. I presumed he was shouting at someone on his phone. That he was a little hard of hearing, perhaps. Maybe he was just shouting to himself. There were loud thumps sometimes, and I often became concerned that he might have fallen, but then the shouting would resume, and I figured he must have been all right. I'd no idea what the hell he was up to, but I was able to sleep through it, and I decided it was really none of my business. I resolved to ignore the noise as best I could and keep one ear on it. You know, in case I needed to call someone. A couple of weeks in, I ended up knocking on his door anyway. In part, I wanted to make sure he was doing okay, but I was mainly there because I wanted to see if my showing up in person would be what nudged him into keeping the noise to a respectful level. It had, gradually, gotten substantially louder, to the point that he was starting to wake me up in the middle of the night. When I knocked on the door, the shouting stopped, so I knew he'd heard me. He didn't answer, though. I knocked again, but after a few minutes, it became apparent that he wasn't going to speak to me, so I went back, and as soon as I shut my apartment door, the shouting started again. The noise continued to get worse over the coming weeks. The thumps escalated to occasional crashes. The shouting got louder and more intense. I couldn't quite make out his words, but he was obviously very angry about something, and it was frightening to hear. Even more so when, one night, he suddenly started banging on my wall. Now, I'm not a noisy person. I know this. I never listen to music without my headphones on, and I scarcely even have time to watch movies. When I still lived at home, my parents often thought I'd gone out because of how quietly I sat up in my room by myself, drawing or reading or whatever. There was really no reason for him to be banging on my wall, and that just made the whole thing all the more scary. He was clearly irrational, and it crossed my mind that he might be having some sort of breakdown. I was worried about him, sure, but far more worried about the danger I might have been in. I was reluctant to call the cops, though, until at least I was sure I really had to. Nobody likes a snitch. I hung on a little longer. In a couple of short days, it all became unbearable. He was practically screaming now, yelling awful, vulgar words in a furious rage at the top of his voice. The banging on the wall got louder and more violent to the point that I was sure he was throwing things at it. The impact made my pictures rattle and fall down. Last night, among the dreadful roars and the demolition job he was doing on his apartment, he screamed my name. I heard the words, clear as a bell, and went cold. The idea of all that rage being directed at me was simply terrifying. I didn't even want to think about how he knew my middle name. I hadn't used it for years. There and then I called the cops. I almost didn't hear them arrive. I'd put my headphones on shortly after I'd made the call so I didn't have to listen to the awful sounds coming from the other apartment while I sat there waiting for help. It was by pure chance that they knocked during a gap between songs. There were 2 officers, a young man and an older one. Both had mustaches, I noticed. The younger one did all the talking. He asked to double-check a few details first, so I told him when the noise started, what sort of sounds I'd heard, how well I knew the tenant, and lastly, that I had very clearly heard him shout my name. I gave dates and times. I kept a log. He was very pleasant, thanking me for the call and reassuring me that there was nothing to worry about, but he kept repeating himself, a little incredulously. Are you sure the noise was from that side? For 4 weeks. And he definitely called your name. I pressed him to find out why it was that they didn't seem to believe me, and he shrugged as he told me, finally, that they just couldn't fathom where the noise would have been coming from. They had already gained entry to the apartment, you see, and found the old guy on the floor in the kitchen. He'd probably been lying there for about a month, likely since the day he'd moved in. He was dead. The younger cop carried on talking, but I was only half listening. I think he said the old man had taken a tumble and cracked his head on the way down, that there hadn't been anyone else inside. He said something about the smell. The officers went out into the corridor to do whatever it was they needed to do, and I just stood there with the door open, staring at nothing. My God, I could smell him now. I knew I had to get out of there, so I started packing as fast as I could. I wasn't sure where I was going, but decided to worry about that later, rather than spend another night in that place. The authorities busied around for a short while, and eventually some more people came to take the body away. Eventually, they locked up the door behind them and left the old man's apartment empty. As I heard the ambulance pull away, the banging started again. "31 Ghosts," written by Dr. Gallow. Somewhere, there is an old and empty town where nobody ever goes. It doesn't appear on any map, and it's just far enough away from its closest neighbors that travelers and tourists seldom notice it, and those who do drive on. The people who live in those neighboring towns know well enough to stay away, especially after dark. What few visitors have ventured to its border have not stayed long. There is a sickness to it, they say. An atmosphere that is unquestionably unwelcoming for humans or, indeed, any living thing. No birds fly above, and no animals can be heard in the woods and fields around it. The empty buildings have rotted and warped over time. Wooden barns creak like old bones and lean over oddly where their sides have sunk ever deeper into the ground beneath. The earth is very soft here. So soft for buried secrets to scrabble their way back out. But that's for later. The few brick houses are always dark, even during the day. The windows remain largely and uncharacteristically intact for such an abandoned place, save for those the elements have cracked and shattered. There are no children nearby brave enough to stone them out. There are sometimes pale faces behind the panes in upstairs rooms, they say. In the center of the town lies its church. It was a simple affair in its glory, and an even simpler one now without his followers trudging through it, bearing their souls to admonish themselves of responsibility for their thoughts and deeds. To look at it, you would think he had forgotten his house here, along with the town. Perhaps you'd be right. The pumpkins they carved all those years ago. The paper lanterns and cutouts of ghosts and spiders blown away to naught. The banners and straw witches are all gone. There is nothing left to remind anyone what night it was when that little town turned sour. But there are still a few who do remember all the same. They had banded together to make it one they would never forget. The children had dressed themselves in spooky and devilish finery. The adults had made sure the store had ordered in beer and booze in plentiful supply. They laid out the tables under the light of the moon, in what passed for the town square, and had themselves the very best of times. Preparation of the food was a shared and joyous burden, a veritable feast of local dishes made from the freshest local ingredients, including old Uncle Jonah's mushroom broth. All 31 of them had left for bed with a belly full, and the taste of it lingering on their tongues, but none had been allowed to help make it. It's a secret family recipe, he'd said. Had anyone else been allowed about his stove, they might have noticed the odd shape of the mushrooms, where his aged eyes had failed, and seen that they were not, in fact, mushrooms at all. That same night, the poison sickness came and took them, one by one. Women and men, boys and girls and babies screamed as they twisted and cramped and bled in their blankets. By morning, there were 31 dead bodies, and left behind by those cold, ruined vessels, 31 ghosts. The ones that hadn't gone to the party, the ones who lived, didn't stick around to spoil town for very much longer. They were the first to hear the whispers and giggles in otherwise empty rooms, or see children they knew to be dead staring at them intently from dark street corners by night. They were the first to feel cold fingers about their throats while they slept, and to wake up choking in the dark. Soon, the town was home to none but the dead. And the living, well, they kept their unspoken promises to one another and honored that covenant born of fear and tempered by a longing to forget. They didn't speak of that night while they made their new homes, nor did they tell a single soul about the things that now dwelt in those abandoned, unlit streets. Until one of them did. If you were to ask him, Barry wouldn't have been able to tell you why he decided to tell the guy behind the bar about it all on a sunny afternoon. He had no survivor's guilt. What had happened to those people was just something that happened to those people, he'd always thought. Carrying the secret with him was no burden. The reason he persisted in keeping the secret like the others was because, like the others, he just knew that telling it was the wrong thing to do. More than that, it was a bad thing to do. For many years, the thought of telling anyone about it made him anxious. He felt a tremendous sense of foreboding when it crossed his mind, as if to tell the tale would mean consequences he didn't fully understand. But here he was, his caution depleted by 3.5 gin and tonics, and he spilled his guts to the barman about it all. The Halloween festivities, the broth, the horror of that next morning, and the night thereafter, when he got out of the bathtub to find lots of little baby handprints all over the inside of the steamed-up bathroom window. Barry finished his 4th drink and made his way home. And he didn't really think too much about what he'd done at all after that. The bartender thought about the story a lot, for not one night passed after his encounter with Barry before he, too, started to see the tiny handprints all around the windows and surfaces of his apartment. It was the ones that appeared, slapping into the mirror as he shaved, that really got to him, and he gave himself a nasty cut under the jawline. When his wife saw the blood, she asked him how he'd managed to do it so deep, and he told her the whole story all over again. And there it was, another thread, another strain out there in the world. It was a year before the bartender fell off the stepladder. He was tired. The awful wailing kept him awake most nights, and the unseen things that pushed his coffee mugs off the counter to smash against the kitchen floor at least a couple of times a week were determinedly cruel. Whether he wobbled and fell in sheer exhaustion, or was given a nudge by a hidden hand, only he could tell you. But the truth died with him when his temple cracked against the coffee table edge as he landed. The light bulb in his hand went unbroken. The bartender's ex-wife is still in the convent. She doesn't speak to anyone anymore, and her sisters presume she has taken a vow of silence. In truth, she so desperately wants the things that drove her from her home to leave her alone that she keeps her mouth shut so as not to attract their attention. After she left home, and her husband with it, and before she stopped talking, she told a friend from work what had been going on. She told him that it had all started with the bartender's chance encounter with a stranger one day, and that damnable story he'd told. She related as best she could remember, and within the week, her friend had cut his own wrists once the dead man with the black, lolling tongue who stared at him from the foot of his bed had become too much to bear. There are fewer than 31 ghosts in that town now. Soon they'll all be gone, unchained and eager to spread their misery to the living. Their freedom comes from a simple transaction. Their story listened, the listener solved. The latest escapee has traveled very far to keep up their end of the bargain. He was despicable in life, and the townsfolk had no clue as to the horrors he perpetrated on the unwary waifs and strays he managed to entice into his parlor. He had a penchant for restraints and rusty tools and hiding in the dark. One can only imagine how keen he will be to meet someone who can bleed again. He didn't send his thanks, but I'm sure he'll pass them on directly, and very, very soon, dear listener.
My husband is using me to appear human. Written by twocantherapper. I met him, the husband, 2 years ago. I don't want to get sidetracked by the story of how I became, as the English call it, a mail-order bride. That story is harrowing and depressing enough in itself. The war left a lot of orphans on both sides of the new border. Many have similar stories to mine. I don't want to waste however long I've got by sharing experiences that differ little from any other girl whose childhood died in the war. So many of us ended up press-ganged by hungry communities into going in the Russian men's vans. So many ended up here, or America, or Saudi Arabia, to share beds with disgusting men so families back home could keep coal in the furnace one more winter. A tale retold 1,000 times over by every woman that's lived it. Their stories have nothing mine does not. Where my story differs is the ending. None of those other daughters of the war ended up with someone like the husband. This, I guarantee. It called itself Mr. Danforth. The first thing it said to me when I arrived at Heathrow was, "You are called Mrs. Danforth." It wasn't a question. It was a command. Despite what you're thinking, this didn't raise suspicion. I'd had very few conversations with men that didn't start with embarking orders. My first thoughts of the husband were that he would be a man like all those except father. All I was thinking as he walked me to his SUV was, and so I go from the hands of one pig into the hands of another. How wrong I was. I didn't properly inspect the husband until I was in the back seat. I hadn't looked at him much in the airport. I'd kept my head down, staring at the floor because that's what the Russian men told me to do. It took a few hours to reach the house. Plenty of time for me to stare at the husband in the rearview mirror, to get a proper look at the man whose bed I'd been sold into. That was when alarm bells started ringing. As the SUV trundled down increasingly less maintained roads, my mind was running through possible explanations for my new husband's face. It was rigid, stiff. None of the muscles of his wide brow or angular jaw twitched, clenched, or moved at all. For 3 whole hours, his skin was off too. Like, not literally, but something about it troubled me for reasons I couldn't place. I think it was the tone. The hues of his face were too uniform, too smooth. Almost the exact same shade of gray, almost peach all over. There was no ruddiness to his cheeks, no darkness under his eyes. For a man I'd been told was in his 40s, he had none of the scars, laughter lines, or crow's feet I'd expected. His face had almost no crevices and creases at all. His eyes created a distrust I had no trouble explaining. They remained as still as his face throughout our silent journey. Even when we turned corners, his gaze remained locked straight ahead. I tried coughing once or twice to see if I could attract his attention. Nothing. Despite the unease this caused, I couldn't ignore that there was something to those eyes that is undeniably beautiful. Mesmerizing, even. Part of me wonders if that's why it had no trouble enticing the unfortunate souls in the basement. The husband's eyes have a shimmer to them, a majestic light. That's the only way I can describe it. In my native Serbian, the word I'd use is sveti, but even that doesn't feel quite right. Everything in those sockets, from the unblemished whites to the smooth, particularly perfect circular pupils, sparkles like the rarest of ocean pearls. In any other context, that shine would be awe-inspiring, beautiful, wondrous. In the face of the husband, the man that doesn't blink, the enticing gleam has new undertones. In that face, the twinkling feels less like gazing at stars in distant galaxies and more like realizing the light you followed through murky waters is attached to a deep sea monstrosity. For 3 hours, we sat in silence. I actually jumped a little when the wheels ground to a halt. The husband didn't say anything, not until he'd left the car and opened the passenger side door. This is Mr. and Mrs. Danforth's building. Follow. Now that the Russian men were safely a plane journey behind me, I allowed myself to pay more attention to the husband's words. I recognized immediately what I'd been too shell-shocked to notice before. He was speaking fluent Serbian. I mean, fluent, too. His pronunciation was so perfect. He could easily have landed a job as a newsreader back home. This was a shock. I'd been implicitly told that he wouldn't speak Serbian, that almost no English people did. The Russian men loved to remind us of that. We all knew why, too. It made sure we knew we were alone, that we were isolated. That if we tried to flee our new homes, nobody could understand enough to help. Isolated. Zabachin, in the language I knew. I couldn't think of a more fitting word for my new accommodation. The bungalow stood alone. For miles in every direction were nothing but fields of wilted and rotting vegetables. The muted grumble of motorway gridlock could be picked up when the wind blew the right way, but only on the absolute edges of my hearing. In a few spots on the horizon I could see the amber haze of light pollution reflected on the underbellies of rolling clouds, pregnant with rain. These telltale signs of civilization were distant, so distant that I knew if I ran it would be days before I reached one. Inside, I found no respite for my clenched jaw or shallow breathing. There are 4 rooms. The largest are the kitchen, dining area, and bedroom. Even they are pokey, though. The bedroom barely fits the cast iron bed I'm hiding under. The bathroom has full working amenities, which is something, at least. The other room was the first item of discussion on the husband's agenda. The basement. Entry is strictly forbidden. He made the punishment for transgressions clear, too. Not first, Mrs. Danforth. Can find more, Mrs. Danforth. His warning sent a chill down my spine. After instructing me to cook us both a meal of baked beans, which he didn't eat, he commanded me to retire to bed. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in the dark, tears streaming down my face, listening to the creaking footsteps from the kitchen. Every time they'd clump closer to the door, my heart skipped a beat, breath catching in my throat. That moment I was expecting, when I'd feel his weight sagging the mattress, hear the groan of the springs that signaled the initiation of the wifely duties he'd paid for. And they never came. This was a small relief, at least. In fact, by a week or two, I managed to sleep in relative peace for a few hours each night. Within a month, I only found I couldn't on the nights that... Well, we'll get to that. And here's the thing. Until last night, I played by the rules. It's been 2 years, and I'm still Mrs. Danforth. There hasn't been a single day in that time the husband hasn't terrified me. However, he's never laid a hand on me in any context. 2 years is a long time. There have been nights when... God. I hate myself for this. I would have let him just for something resembling human contact. The only bodies I've touched in 2 whole years were cold, clammy, and covered in loose soil. Other than that, I haven't had so much as a handshake. Not speaking to a real person for 2 years drives your mind to dark places. But touch starvation is a different madness entirely. If I ever make it out from under this bed, if I can make it through the rotting vegetables and find civilization beneath those amber clouds, I'm hugging the first person I see and never letting go. The first night was the blueprint for each that followed. My fear never subsided, but it did change. With every month, it became ever more tinted with hopelessness, a despairing melancholy. Tears have been a large part of my day. It was about 6 months into my marriage that the weight of it all broke me so much I couldn't stop them falling. It only took a week to realize I didn't need to conceal them from the husband. His smooth, motionless face never reacted to sobbing or anything else. I've tried screaming at him, insulting him, pleading, questioning, talking about inane nonsense even. Nothing. Nothing. I must have retold my story, my life story 3 dozen times to those gazeless, shimmering eyes. Yelled every curse, cracked every joke, nothing. Aside from commands in stunted Serbian like, "You will wake up now," and "Reading prevents mental degradation. You will read." He's never said a word to me. Every day has the same routine. He has me cook meals that he never eats, do menial cleaning tasks, and when he goes in the SUV to one of the patches of amber clouds, he instructs me to read. It's also my job to answer the door. This, I think, is the reason why it purchased my hand in marriage from the Russian men. Despite our isolation, there were many knockings. I was told on the first night that Mrs. Danforth's main role was ensuring that Mr. Danforth wasn't disturbed. That meant telling the various council workers, local political candidates, cold calling salesmen, and preaching religious types that he was away on business. Always, he'd stand behind the door, just out of sight of the visitors, looking down at me with that rippling glow as I rattled off the textbook excuse. It went the same way every time. Well, almost every time. Sometimes, such as with the third visitor, the husband would intervene. I'm sure that by this point you have wondered, are you telling me that for 2 years you've never tried to escape or stand up to him, even though he's never laid a hand on you? This question I understand, and it is one I can answer. As I said, the husband never laid a hand on me. The same can be said for visitors to the house. I don't know what criteria it had for deciding which visitors became victims. All I know is that the third visitor, a poor boy barely out of his teenage years raising money for some cause or other, ticked the right boxes. Mr. Danforth isn't on a business trip. The husband's word rang out from the shadow behind the open door. He was speaking in English now, accent as clipped and precise in the British tongue as it had been in Serbian. He stepped out into the light, standing just behind me at the threshold of the shack. I'd barely been married to him a week, but already I knew him enough for this sudden change in behavior to sound alarm bells. Mrs. Danforth was confused, the husband said. Please excuse her, she is not well. I gulped. So did the young man on the porch. He was trembling in his father's suit, a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead to pool at the crease of his brow. Right. Yes, well, Mr. Danforth, the lad stammered, fumbling with his clipboard and pen. I'm here to talk about... You will come inside Mr. Danforth's house. It wasn't a question. I stood in the doorway, trying my best to ignore the prickling chill of the husband's breath on the back of my neck. For a few drawn-out moments, I watched the boy's face twist into visible discomfort. In the end, his vulnerable mind couldn't win. I stood aside to let him slouch into the kitchen, wincing as the husband slammed the door behind him. Mrs. Danforth will go to sleep. Again, the husband's words weren't an inquiry. It was obvious they were addressed at me, if for no other reason than because he'd effortlessly switched back to Serbian. But it's 2:30. The second set of Serbian words I heard came from my own lips. I blinked at the husband, perplexed at my own outburst, but nonetheless suddenly inspired. The mixture of confusion and defiance had me rooted to the spot. Right to the spot. I said nothing further, but still didn't move. Behind the husband, the trembling boy took a seat at the kitchen table. There were tears streaming down his face. I could tell that somewhere beyond those watering eyes was a voice, screaming at the boy to get out of that chair and run. The boy's body wasn't listening. It had stopped listening the moment Mr. Danforth addressed it. All that body could do now was obey in a way that I found myself, for the first time, not doing. The reason it took 2 years to work up the courage to be under this bed is because of how the husband reacted to my first and only flirtation with disobedience. I was expecting him to raise his fists, to fly across the room in a fit of fury, to beat me back into submissiveness. The moment never came. As I said, he's never laid a hand on me. He doesn't have to. I felt the sharp stab at the base of my skull the instant his eyes narrowed. Before I had time to fully register its existence, the pain had spread across my entire head, drowning every nerve in acidic, burning agony. My nails were digging into my scalp around the moment I noticed I was screaming. Through the white and black spots peppering my vision, I could see the husband standing over me. The change in perspective was the only reason I knew I'd collapsed. For the first time since meeting him, his expression had changed. He wasn't staring blankly ahead anymore. He was glaring. His eyes were thin slits, allowing only slithers of their intense otherworldly iridescence through. The beams weren't pointing directly ahead, but down at the floor, down at me. Lips that had only so far moved to form words were crunched into a scowl. The muscles in his jaw bulged so much that I'm amazed his near-perfect teeth didn't crack under the pressure. That was the moment I first understood the depth of my true fear of this man, this thing. It was when I was writhing in inexplainable agony, seeing him towering over me in his ironed polo shirt and jeans, seeing him notice me. He noticed me for the first time. It's that fear which has kept me docile and trembling for 2 long years, and it was there, on those freshly scrubbed tiles, that I cowered before it for the first time. When the husband spoke again, it was through clenched teeth. Mrs. Danforth will go to sleep. Yes. Once more, I heard words leave my lips. The instant they did, my head was released from the invisible barrage of fire. The husband relaxed back into his usual blank slate state. I couldn't bring myself to look over my shoulder as I crawled to the bedroom door. I caught a quick glance while I pulled myself up to my trembling feet, using the handle, though. Brief. Accidental, but enough to paint a clear picture for the darkest places my wandering mind can go in the quiet hours. The husband had turned his back on me. He was facing the kitchen table, standing above the acne-scarred young man. The boy hadn't said a word throughout my ordeal. One look at his face told me why. He was terrified, as I was. Enough tears had fallen from his cheeks that a small puddle formed on the tabletop. He was doing his best to stare straight ahead, but every so often, he'd be unable to stop his gaze flicking to meet the husband. Whenever their eyes met, he'd let out a soft whimper. One of his legs broke out into violent judders as I closed the door behind me. I curled up under the threadbare duvet, willing myself to forget the nauseating thought that the spasms were from a trapped mind resisting induced paralysis. Lying awake with tears in my eyes was the norm. That night, the reason I had to bite down on my hand to muffle my cries was new, though. Yeah, that was new. The sounds that snaked and writhed through the cracks around that door were... What's the best way to convey it? Just haunting. Haunting? Yes, haunting. I can't think of a better word, actually. They lived on as earworms for many months after. Specters that teased explanations for the thuds and scrapes in the nights that followed from the worst depths of my imagination. The screams started as soon as the bedclothes were over my head. High-pitched, ragged screams I knew all too well from hiding in my parents' closet during the war, feeling relieved that the men with their AK-47s had chosen the family next door. It was no relief hearing screams like that now. Even worse, when they changed to the other kind of screaming I recognized. The kind I'd also heard in my parents' closet. The kind my father did when the men with the AK-47s hadn't chosen a family next door or down the street. The kind he'd made when they'd beaten him senseless, tied him to a chair, and taken out their box of DIY tools. Hearing a barely grown man's howls of torment is harrowing enough. Were I a lucky woman, that wouldn't That would have been all I heard. Such as it is, luck has never been in my favor. The wet slurps of flesh tearing, muted snaps as bones cracked, the tightening of eardrums when the drill whirred into life. None of the sounds I associated with screams like that were present. Instead, they were noises that nothing in my memory could reconcile. It started with clicking, a prolonged barrage of ever faster skittering like ball bearings bouncing off a car windshield. The boy was babbling something when they ended, but his words were muffled by the thick wood of the door. His terror wasn't. Once the clicks fell silent, the second unexplained noise started. This was humming, a deep, electronic, unwavering thrum that, even through the door, I could tell came from machinery. Within 20 seconds, it ceased, abruptly, and without indication. The exact moment the lad's wailing grew from panic-induced to pained. The unexplained noises, the ones coming from whatever it was the husband was doing, had also taken a turn. There was I don't know what to call it, like a whistling? A shrill, continuous note, just breathy, but definitely not organic. It was far too monotonous and unbending for that. There was a metallic tint to it, too. Something I can't quite put into words, but nevertheless conjured visions of rusted pipe and creaking gears. This continued for a full 15 minutes, long after the screaming from the young man fell silent. My teeth were clamped on my hand with such pressure that I tasted blood by the time it ended. I waited at least an hour until the thump of something heavy being dragged down to the basement had ceased. I fell asleep shaking, as I always did, although harder than I had since the war. The husband said nothing of the previous night when he woke me to cook a breakfast he once again didn't eat. My instruction for that day was simple. Mrs. Danforth will clean. I could see why as soon as I left the bedroom, the young man's chair sat at the epicenter of an explosion of dark red stains. Stains that sprayed out from a specific point. When I realized that point, was roughly where the boy's head would have been, I couldn't stop myself from breaking down into uncontrolled sobs. These continued throughout cooking the requested porridge and through the silent meal. The memory of what happened when it stared at me, when it started boiling my brain with nothing but a glare, was the only reason I could finish the meal as instructed. Every mouthful took willpower to prevent returning once swallowed. This has been, perhaps, one of the hardest conditions of my situation to endure. There are only two places at the kitchen table, and the one the husband chooses for his guests isn't the one he sits at to not eat. I'm not instructed to clean until after breakfast. The husband does this deliberately, I think. The message is clear. Look at the blood you sit in. There were other Mrs. Danforths. These nights happen at least once every 2 weeks, although it can sometimes be more. Highest frequency was 4 in as many days. After a while, I couldn't help but start asking questions. I did try fielding them directly to him, which received the same response as every other interaction I've tried to initiate. Since that got me nowhere, I was left to muse, hypnotize, and, when I couldn't stomach it, listen. After 2 years of this, I still had no clue what he was doing or why he was doing it. The why, I can still only guess. I found out the what last night. But we'll cover that. I've got to tell you about the phone in the basement first. It was yesterday, and one of those mornings that I sat in a 6-foot scab. The husband had not long ventured out to one of the distant amber hazes to purchase food he would never eat. I was scrubbing the red stains left by an unfortunate fundraiser for endangered pandas when, dangling, almost out of earshot, I heard it. It was coming from the basement, oozing up through the cracks beneath the sponge and soap suds. I thought it was a bell at first, or a wind chime. Then the buzzing started. It had been so long since I heard one that I almost didn't recognize. It was a phone ringing. My heart skipped several beats. I had to manually restart my breaths, refusing to believe what my ears were telling me. A quick glance at the window was all the reassurance I need. The husband had only just left. He was always gone for at least 2 hours. I had time. Hands shaking, I put down the sponge, checking the moldy fields one last time. The memory of that mind stab glared, still fresh despite 2 years passing. I gulped. Every step took more willpower than I think you'd ever believe, but I stopped following my instructions. Instead, I walked toward the basement door. It amazes me still that it wasn't locked this entire time. I guess he doesn't care about any Mrs. Danforth seeing or discovering his secrets, although why would he? Why? Why would he, if he can just replace us? The smell hit me first. It rolled out the doorway the second I cracked it ajar, pungent, acrid, heavy, and with a sweetness that brings no comfort. Once more in my mind, I was the little girl in the war, finally daring to leave my home after 3 days, staring at my father's glassy, unmoving eyes through the gap in the closet door. In the basement, I was fortunate enough that the angle of the sun through the window, the kitchen window, hit the doorway just enough to provide some light. Enough to see that there had been dozens of air fresheners of every conceivable shape, scent, and size nailed to the ceiling. This, at least, explained why the cloying stench of human decay hadn't reached the kitchen. There was a small vent in one corner, but I knew this alone wouldn't have been enough to mask the smell of all those corpses. There were dozens of them. A mass of bodies heaped in the far corner that spread almost to the stairs. I recognized all of them. Despite the varying stages of decay, every single one. From the near-skeletal postman through to the bloated, purifying lost hiker that picked the wrong place to ask for directions. This, I expect, is no surprise, though. It wasn't to me. Recognizing those bodies wasn't why I collapsed into a wailing mess at the foot of the basement stairs. It was the machine down here with them. In the opposite corner, underneath the feeble ventilation shaft, was an oven. Not a small one, like the pathetic thing in the kitchen. This was an industrial unit, the kind of furnace found in morgues and crematoriums. It was the implication more than anything. The oven had clearly been there a while, judging by the rust and soot. He hadn't been bluffing about the other Mrs. Danforth. The presence of that furnace confirmed 2 things. The husband had been at this since long before I arrived, and that he'd had to make no effort to conceal his activities. Either nobody's tried to stop him, or nobody can. I'm praying it's the former. The phone restarted its jingle, snapped me out of my despair. My stomach dropped when I pinpointed the source. No, I thought. No, 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 please. Please, anything but this. It only took one blink for the basement to vanish. I was back in the war, reaching for the keys in my father's pocket so I could leave our flat and find food, screaming as his cold, stiff form fell on top of me from the bed, wailing for help that wasn't there as I struggled to free myself from underneath the dead weight of a man 4 times my size. No. Snap out of it. I swallowed, deciding to obey the inner defiance, finding encouragement in yet another buzzing tinkle from within the pile. I had to bake. I had to beat back the intrusive memories every second my arm was in that heap of decaying flesh. I was only feeling my way through clammy limbs and blood-crusted fabric for about 30 seconds. But my perception managed to stretch them to decades. The feeling of slick, waxy skin on my arm, the obnoxious, noxious tang of rotting human meat mere inches from my nostrils, the moist groans and creaks as I disturbed built-up gases and fluids inside bloated organs. All of it merged into a sensory overload. I'm still amazed I managed to push through when my hand wrapped around something hard, plastic and vibrating. I couldn't pull it out fast enough. I didn't stop to look at my prize until I was certain I was back in the bedroom and not having some kind of fever dream. The phone, this phone, had 50% charge remaining. I turned it off immediately, not wanting to waste 1 second of precious battery life, but where to hide it? The solution seemed so stupid I caught myself laughing for the first time in, well, long enough that I'm getting tearful trying to work it out. A while. Yeah, it's been a while. The one place in the house the husband has never been, aside from the bathroom, which offered no hiding spaces. I heard the crunch of tires on dirt at the same time I finished rearranging the pillow to make triply sure there was no indication of the treasure stuffed inside. I'm quite impressed with my quick thinking for this next part. Obviously, I'd not done the cleaning as instructed. I needed an excuse. Something that wouldn't arouse suspicion. So what did I do? I lay on the ground in the unwashed blood and claimed I'd passed out. The husband queried, and I fed it a whole yarn about collapsing on the floor and having no idea how much time had passed. It worked. He instructed me to cook and consume chicken soup, and then continue with the cleaning as instructed. The day became one of the longest of my 2-year hell. For the first time, I had to force crying, moroseness, defeat. I couldn't remember when I'd last had reason to smile. And now I was willing my lips not to curl upwards. All I could think about was this phone, this message. I can barely speak my English, or any English. Phoning the police is pointless. I can't explain where I am, let alone what's happening. Writing it, though? I've had 2 years with no mental stimulation besides reading classic literature with the assistance of an English-Serbian dictionary. I was mentally planning this message all yesterday afternoon. I didn't anticipate writing it so soon, but a lot's changed since I found this phone. Last night was one of those nights, you see. This one was a woman, older than me by several decades, meeting constituents on behalf of some local politician. The scene played out the same as it always did. Mrs. Danforth will go to sleep. And I didn't protest. The woman was doing the standard paralysis panic dance when I shut the door behind me, and as usual, I did my best to avoid her face, to spare myself the mental image of the terrified, pleading look they always had in their eyes. Once more, I was laying under the bedclothes. I could feel the coolness of the phone in my palm when the whimpers and screams started. The perfect cover to start writing, right? I wish I'd thought so. Instead, for some reason, the reminder of my successful venture into the basement emboldened me. I found myself not hurriedly sending out an SOS to anyone on the internet that could help, but instead creeping back toward the door. I needed to know, you see. I'd never been able to put this behind me if... I'd never be able to put this behind me if I didn't know. Idiot. Once more, the pressure of teeth on my palm drew blood. Through the crack in the door, I saw everything. Immediately, I regretted my decision, but so powerful was the morbid curiosity, cultivated over 2 long years, that I couldn't look away. By last night, I already had incredibly strong suspicions about the husband, that he was probably better referred to as it. The nightmare playing out in front of me confirmed every single one of them. Both the husband and the woman were sitting at the kitchen table, exactly as he and I did for every meal he didn't eat. She was still ensnared by whatever kept his victims docile and obedient. She'd managed to wrestle back just enough control to start screaming, for one of her hands to occasionally spasm and flap on the laminate tabletop, but that's it. For his part, the husband was moving the most he ever had in our 2-year marriage. I now knew what the clicking sounds were. Already the urge to scream was so much I felt lightheaded, and they were only just getting warmed up. There were hundreds of them. Miniature, clockwork men of varying proportions and sizes, the largest of which stood barely over 2 inches tall. They were pouring out of the husband's slack open jaw. Some rappelled down on ropes made of string and twine, others opted to free fall. The clicking I'd heard on every one of those nights, it was the sound of them hitting the table, of accountable pairs of tiny brass feet scurrying around on the laminate. They moved fast. So fast that some were barely a blur. The larger ones pointed and directed the runts of the horde, and they were ushering them to their assigned tasks with cracks of spark-tipped prods no longer than a toothpick. Each knew their role. It took them almost no time at all to set up the shoebox-sized machine they dragged out of the husband's open chest cavity. The husband's response to all this? The same as his response to everything else. There was no reaction to the sea of copper and bronze cascading from his wide maw. He didn't flinch when some of them just clambered up his shirt to unbutton it, when they pulled at seams on his hairless chest to peel back that rubbery skin. As his innards were revealed inch by inch, he didn't even blink. And why? Because he didn't exist. It, the husband, was just a shell. A vessel for this mass of clanking mechanical activity to travel amongst us undetected. His iron ribcage held no organs. There was no beating heart, no rising and falling lungs, no gurgling stomach. Behind it lay nothing save for a large pearlescent blue steel box. As I watched, eyes welling with tears, some of the clockwork men started pulling levers and crank handles set into the husband's spine. There was a faint whoosh of unseen steam valves as the miniature locking mechanisms holding the blue steel box in place released. It landed with a heavy thud, where the writhing heap of cogs and gears was thickest. To my amazement, none of the rusted figures were crusted. Instead, there was a flurry of skittering metallic limbs. Then, much like a dead tarantula carried by ravenous ants, the box glided toward the trembling woman. That's when I learned the source of the second sound. The unwavering motor-like humming. It came from the array of pistons, gears, and other pneumatic components hidden behind the husband's face. While some of the clockwork throng got to adjusting the knobs and dials on the blue steel box, the husband's head was opening. A great split ran vertically along its center, rising from his chin like he was being unzipped from within. The whirring started when the segment started rising up and outward on the arrangement of intricate pneumatic extenders. Those eyes that barely moved, they were lenses. Thick one-way lenses, so that the thing sitting within the source of that mesmerizing paralysis-inducing glow could view the outside world. I've never seen something so ugly and beautiful at once. The body was grotesque, an aberration that went against everything sane and decent. It was barely 12 inches long, and most of its mass lay in its bulbous body. The quivering yellowish body pulsated in a small metal chair that emerged from the husband's open throat. Around it was dozens of wheels, switches, levers, and valves. The aberration manipulated these with its 7 wiry arms. These thin appendages wormed their way from the creature's neck, moving and flicking like reptilian tongues around the maddeningly complex interface. Above the ring of purplish tendrils were 2 gnarled horns protruding from behind its tiny collarbone. These were thicker than the tentacle arms and half as short. They weren't mobile either. The darker flesh of their surface seemed scarred, burned. Open sores on its surface wept a whitish liquid I could smell as soon as the face segments drifted apart. A rancid smell. A smell far too close to the cloying miasma in the basement. Between those sore-crusted stumps, though, what hovered between them was Sveti. Holy. There's no other word. It was the light. A single orb of it floating between the bony horns. I can't tell you what color it was because it was all of them. Not in the way that white is all colors of light either. Your brain registers white light as white. My brain was registering the orb as white, black, red, yellow, green, purple, every color I could name simultaneously, and even some that I can't. Exposed to the world, it was bright, almost blindingly so. If I hadn't spent my nights under blankets facing the wall, I'd have noticed it flashing through the cracks between the floor and door. The orb was no larger than a chicken's egg. Somehow, the moment I saw it, I knew its truths, that it was sentient, aware, that it and the phlegm-coated blight beneath were one. The instantaneous awareness of the power of the thing was overwhelming. My tears flowed more freely than they ever had, even during the war. I was only in its presence a few minutes, but during that time, all cognitive freedom left me. My sense of time, place, self, all gone. There was nothing except the light. The woman's screech snapped me out of my awe. A wave of nausea welled up to my throat. It was obvious why she was screaming. And it took everything in my power not to scream too. The brass army had finished setting up the blue steel box. The woman was screaming because 2 sharp needles, each about 1.5 feet long, had launched themselves from the machine on the table. They'd found the corners of her eyes. She wasn't crying tears now, but rivers of dark red. The chrome needles drilled through her tear ducts, deep into her sockets, tearing through bone and optical nerves. I knew exactly what they were trying to find. I'd read enough classics with medical protagonists to recognize lobotomies. What I'd never read about were the apparitions. The whistling sound was, well, I don't know what it was. All I know is that it started the moment those needles began to glow red hot. A small crystal had risen from a port at the box's center. It too shone with crimson heat. Above the first-sized rock was a constantly shifting horde of spectral figures. Only one of them I recognized. The woman in the chair. The one whose eyes were rolling back in her skull. It didn't take me long to put the pieces together. I was seeing her life. A montage of ghostly scenes from her past, pulled from her brain to be displayed and dissected by the aberration in the husband's head. It was leaning forward in its chair, the 7 worm arms quivering excitedly. I could tell it was searching for something, that there was some vision the glowing orb was hoping to witness. I had no idea what, and still don't. I don't want to find out either. Whatever it was, the glowing orb didn't find it in this particular set of memories. I could sense the frustration ebbing from it when the husband's face began to retract. I almost tore a ligament in my hand when the needles retracted. They left the woman's head with a snap. Such force was there that her head wrenched. It wrenched back with an audible crack as vertebrae in her neck split. A wide cone of blood and cranial fluid sprayed from the wounds, covering the table while the last beats of life twitched out of her body. So yeah, that was last night. The night I found out they didn't notice me watching. The orb-headed aberration of his clockwork minions. This morning was the same as all the others. That is, until they left to get the food they had no reason to consume. Right now, they're grabbing the keys to the SUV to drive after me. They think I've run off into the woods, fields, and bushes in front of the house. That's because I spent half an hour running in said direction. But you see, I then spent another half hour running backward. By the time they figured it out, I'll have run off into the fields behind the house. The ones with the brightest amber in the clouds, where the roar of motorway life comes loudest. I deliberately left the door open and did everything I could to make it look like I'd already run. Thank God it worked. While I was writing this, they were in a rage, tearing about the kitchen and smashing everything they could find. Thanks for providing enough distraction to keep my breathing steady and quiet. Whatever they are, they don't understand people enough to check under a bed. And they're driving off now. So I've got to give it 2 minutes, then run as fast as I damn can toward those clouds. I'm turning this phone off. 20% battery. I might need it. I'll send an update when... Who am I kidding? If I make it. In the meantime, if the place I'm describing seems familiar, my warning is this. Stay the hell away. Whatever they are, they don't have to be shy. They want you to come looking. I've never had a choice in where life takes me. You do. Don't waste it.